There's a few people here this morning who know who these characters are. Some of you I know don't. This guy right here, his name is Joe Rogan. He's one of the biggest podcasters in the United States. He's a comedian and an MMA wrestler and now a commentator on MMA. And this is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a famous atheist. And Richard Dawkins was on Joe Rogan a couple of weeks ago, and it got a lot of attention. And one of the things that they talked about was both of them are not believers, they're atheists, and Richard Dawkins obviously has a name for trying to talk people out of belief. And one of the things that they were talking about is, why is there so much religion in the world? I mean, where did all of this religion start when, there's no God that can be seen and nothing can be proved? Why would there be all these religious people? Not just Christians today or Muslims, but all the way back to Egypt. It seems like religion is ubiquitous for almost all of human history. Where did all of this religion come from? And they talked about various ideas about psychology and projection, but I don't really think the question is that hard. Religion has always been about testing the gods to see if they would bring you favor. One of the world's oldest books is the book of Job that you have in your Bible. And the religion that is represented by Job's friends is very much the standard representation of religion in the world, which is, if you do right, you'll be blessed, and if you do wrong, you'll be cursed. And so by that definition, Job, who had suffered tremendous calamity, the loss of all of his wealth, the death of his children, surely Job must have done something wrong to deserve all that calamity. And so Job's three friends come around him and point to him and say, "See, Job, you've done something wrong. There's some secret sin. Why don't you confess? And then maybe God will hear you." And Job doggedly protested and complained that he was innocent. Now, if you remember the story, you know that there's a little bit at the beginning of the book where there's sort of a wager. And Job, in fact, is the object of the wager, which brings all of the calamity. And the point of the book is this ubiquitous assumption about religion: the world is not quite that simple. But this continued throughout the ancient world, and in 410 BC, when the Christian barbarians, the Visigoths, sacked Rome and looted the mansions of the pagans and looted the pagan temples, but didn't touch the Christian churches, the unconverted Romans complained that the fall of mighty Rome had happened because Christianity had spread to the degree that the government and the people were no longer supporting the temples as they should, which prompted St. Augustine to write his magnum opus, The City of God. And even though Richard Dawkins imagines that all of this religion is just a bunch of superstition, we are even religious in our secular ways. Richard Dawkins, of course, asserts that there is no intentionality or purpose behind the mechanisms of nature. If calamity strikes you, that's just chaos. If goodwill strikes you, that's just chaos. The best you can do is try to align the little pieces of your life to attempt to secure the outcomes that you want. But any big questions, any big decisions, can't be done. It's just blind processes. We're living in a giant machine, and the construction of that machine was done without purpose or intentionality. And what that means often is that religion simply becomes politics. My political tribe will save the world. And so what I try to do, we don't talk religion or talk about God, but I want to win you over to my political agenda. If I think this is the great threat of the world, I want to mobilize you to address that threat. If you think this other thing is the great threat of the world, I want to mobilize everyone else to agree and go on. In fact, Richard Dawkins, in one interview that I heard of his once, was talking to a Christian and a Jewish scholar, and whereas they didn't disagree on some of the cherished things that Richard Dawkins talked about, he said to them, well, I don't mind Christians and Jews like you. You seem to be sensible people. And what was really exposed is that, well, Richard Dawkins just doesn't like the believers who are on the other side of whatever political agenda he cares about. And in fact, what we've seen in the last 20 years is not only the rise of people who are unaffiliated with religion, but the polarization around politics among people who are politically engaged. In 1994, Democrats and Republicans, there's a fair amount of overlap between them. But by 2014, there was quite a bit of polarization. But as you'll note, that's only among the politically engaged. Among the less politically engaged, Democrats and Republicans seem to be able to get married and live together and do things together fairly well because they're not glued to either Fox News all the time or CNN all the time. They have lives and they live and off they go. Now, another interesting blogger who is also not a believer runs a very big blog called Slate Star Codex, and just this week he posted an article that asked, where have all the atheists gone? Because about 10 years, guys like Richard Dawkins were in the news, and everyone was all excited about being new atheists. And so he did some numerical calculations, and basically what he realized is that all of those who were 10, 15 years ago yelling about getting rid of churches and Christians and how this was a bane in the world, now they're all just yelling about politics. And that has simply added to the noise. Where have all the atheists gone? Politics became their new godless religion. Now, we've been going through the book of Mark, and one of the things I often try to illustrate is how in Jesus' time and place, politics and religion were not separate things, okay? It's that we don't see a big separation of an attempt to separate politics and religion until we get to the American Revolution. So Jesus is dealing with a very live situation in the country where he lives. The Romans are occupying, the Jews would like the Romans out, and they have all different approaches to dealing with the Romans. So now we find Jesus continuing on doing his ministry, and this is what comes up. In those days, there were again a great crowd without anything to eat. He called his disciples and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now for 3 days and have had nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come a great distance. His disciples replied, how can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? Now those of you who are here every week will remember, didn't we just hear a story like this? Where Jesus kind of snuck away on a boat and the large crowd followed him and they were out in the deserted place and Jesus looks at the crowd and the disciples say, you should send them away so they can get something to eat tonight. And Jesus says to his disciples, you feed them. And then they find 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus prays and breaks the bread and feeds the multitude, and they have 12 baskets left over. This seems to be the same story. And in fact, many scholars who have been reading through the Bible always wonder, well, did the gospel writers get confused? Are they telling the same story again? I don't think so. The language is different, and we'll see that in a minute. So he asked the disciples, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd. They also had a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed. And they ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away, and immediately got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him. So here we have this story of the feeding of the 4,000. Again, these are 4,000 men, so there are women and children there. So this huge multitude. And now some Pharisees come over. And then you might say, well, who are the Pharisees? And we Because we read about the Pharisees in the Bible, we generally think about the Pharisees in religious terms. But it's helpful, to remember that there's a very violent culture war going on around Jesus at the time. And the Pharisees, while they were religious people, also had a political agenda. And while there were some Jews who wanted to get the Romans out by killing them and having violent revolutionaries, the Pharisees were not in that group. That's more the Zealots. There were other Jews that said nuts to the whole business, and they lived in caves out in the desert, and they prayed that God would nuke the whole bunch of them, both the Romans and all those Jews who were compromising with Roman ways sufficiently to live there. Those were the Essenes. They were out in the desert. The Pharisees were sort of moderate, and the Pharisees wanted Jewish people to resist the Romans, but not violently by killing soldiers and things like that, but by observing the law and by following Moses' commandment. And they believed that if they were holy enough and disciplined enough and righteous enough, that God would send angels down or send a deliverer and release them from the Roman tyranny. That was their decision. And you'll notice that there's a very much a religious, political aspect to this. If we're religious in just the right way, then God will jigger the politics to go our way. And that's basically, again, how politics and religion sort of always seem to come together. So the Pharisees come to Jesus, and the Pharisees always have a little bit of a difficulty knowing what to do with Jesus, because in many ways, in terms of all the different political religious faction, Jesus seems the closest to them. He's not irreligious like the aristocracy. He's not hiding out in a cave somewhere in the wilderness like the Essenes. He's not violent against the Romans. And so they're always thinking, maybe we can recruit Jesus to be on our team and to be a Pharisee and to work with us, and maybe together we can get these Romans out of here. But they're frustrated with Jesus because as much as they try to recruit him, he never seems to take the bait. And this will be another story like that. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. Now this is really amazing, because the reason that the Pharisees are paying any attention to Jesus at all is because he's popular, and the reason that he's popular is because everyone around knows he's healing the sick, and causing the blind to see, and causing the deaf to hear, and multiplying loaves and fishes, and doing all of these things. And so the stories just grow, even as we saw last week when Jesus says, don't tell anybody. Everybody knows that he's doing these outrageous, outstanding miracles. That's what he's known for. And so the Pharisees come to Jesus and says, we're still not sure about you. Maybe you can move the moon or something, and then we'll believe you. And how Jesus responds is exactly the reason he so angered the Pharisees. Because there's a certain amount of contempt you have for your political rival. You have this much more contempt for your political traitor. And so eventually, that's how they see Jesus. So the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. Remember last week how Jesus sighed? He's sighing again this week. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. Now that word generation is sort of a tricky Greek word to translate, because it doesn't, when we think generation sort of horizontally. Like everyone who was born between 1964 and 1984, well, those are the busters or something like that. We think of generations like this. But that word is much more generations vertically. And it's much more race than generation. And the race he's talking about isn't just Pharisees or a particular ethnic group. It's the human race. So why does this human race, ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, getting into the boat, and went across to the other side. Now, the reason I started with Dave Rogan and Richard Dawkins is because they, like many, say, look, I'll believe in God if God does something huge. Frederick Buechner once wrote a story where God moved all the stars in the sky, and up written in the sky said, I exist, God. And when the stars moved, everyone got all excited, and the churches were full, and everyone was excited, and it lasted for about 3 months. And after that, everyone just kind of went back around their normal business. And that's part of the point here. So Jesus has this conflict with the Pharisees, and they're arguing with them, and Jesus finally says, all you folks want to do is have some sort of sign. Well, no sign for you. And it's kind of like, well, didn't you just feed 4,000 men plus women and children? Well, that's not enough. Jesus needs to... Okay. So he gets back in the boat, and his disciples had forgotten to bring any bread. Wouldn't you know? You'd think at this point they'd be carrying, a lot of food with them, but no. They get back in the boat. They don't have any bread. They didn't bring any of those 7 baskets. They had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus cautioned them, saying, watch out, because of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Now, y'all listening to that are thinking, what does he mean by that? Well, you're not alone. They said to one another, is it because we have no bread? What's Jesus talking about? The yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? No. Are your hearts hardened? Yes. Do you have eyes and fail to see? Yes. Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? 7. And then he said to them, do you not yet understand? And probably most of you are reading this and saying, yeah, I kind of am with the disciples, because what are you talking about, Jesus? What's the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod? Because that would kind of like be saying the yeast of the Democrats and the yeast of the Republicans. If Jesus was picking one side or the other, we'd sort of understand, but why yeast? Well, everybody here knows what yeast is, and everybody back then knew what yeast is. If you want to make bread, and now I know most of you don't make bread, you just go buy it at the store like I do, but if you want to make bread, you take some dough and some of the other ingredients, and you have a lot of dough, and then you go to Bel Air and you say, I want some yeast, and somebody goes and comes back with a tiny little packet. And you're saying, that's what I need? Yeah, that's what you need. Well, how much of it do I need? And you open the packet, and it looks like just some grains of sand in the bottom, basically. And, well, don't put too much in. Well, what do you mean don't put? There's hardly anything in there. Just a little bit of it will make that loaf rise. Okay. So what's the yeast of the Pharisees? And why would you warn us about the yeast of the Pharisees, who politically are over here, and the yeast of Herod, this not even Jewish Edomite family that was a bunch of coattail riders to the Roman emperors who have basically been trying to use politics and religion to gain favor among the people, but it never works, and they're just as worldly and corrupt as the Romans, but everybody who wants to make any money sides with them because they've been in power forever. Why would you call out both political sides and tell us to watch out for the yeast? And why would you do that after your conflict with the Pharisees asking for a sign? Well, this is a Renaissance painting of a medieval triumph. Not a medieval triumph, but a Roman triumph. And here is the Roman emperor, Pompey. Not the emperor, but the Roman general Pompey. And what he's doing is he's dragging into Rome thousands and thousands of slaves that he had won in battle, and loot of cities he had conquered. And he's bringing them into Rome, and he is receiving the glory, laud, and honor that the people of Rome would bring. And they would all be looking at him, and they'd be saying, he's like a god. This is what we want. This is what we want. This is something we can see. Surely Pompey is favored by the gods, because you can tell, because all of his wonderful success. Why would, after feeding the 4,000, after last week we saw him freeing the tongue of a man and restoring him to hear, and helping the blind see and the lame to walk, and do this again and again and again and again, and thousands of people knowing him for them, why would they come to Jesus and say, well, Jesus, maybe, just maybe we'll think that God is with you if you just show us a sign? Multiplying loaves and fishes isn't sign enough? No, it isn't. Even the disciples, they have one loaf of bread for 12 or 15 or 20 of them. So, well, just is it because we have no bread? And Jesus is like, you're still thinking in this way, aren't you? About bread. You saw me do this twice. You saw me do this, and still, I stilled the storm once, and then you're in a storm again, and you don't believe. I multiply the loaves and fishes once, and then there's another situation which is exactly the same, and still you don't believe. Signs are not going to make us believe. Why? Because that's not the issue. And we know this. We know this in our own lives, because many of you have been Christians for many years. And if I would sit down and I would go back, and maybe it's a situation that I knew about, and I said, remember when this was going on in your life? And remember when you were afraid? And remember when you were desperate? And remember when you prayed to God? And remember when your prayers were answered and you said, oh, God rescued me from this. And then this new thing comes up in your life and you're panicking all over again. And I would say, yeah, but didn't he help you then? No, but Pastor, this is really important now. Yeah, no, I understand. We don't believe or disbelieve because of signs. And the yeast of both sides, the Pharisees and Herod, this is what they're looking for. They're looking for Pompey. What do you imagine Jesus was doing with his miracles? Was he gathering a big crowd so he could be really popular? And once they're really excited about him, okay, now let's go attack, John Brown style. Let's go attack an armory and get a bunch of swords and spears. And they'll make a bunch of swords and spears, and then they'll have an army, and then they'll take over this city, and then they'll take over that city. And Jesus can do miracles because, if you can still a storm, you can make a storm. And if you read ancient history, you find how many navies in the ancient world were simply destroyed by a storm. And so then one empire rules another because the storm wipes out their navy. Well, if you got a guy who can make a storm, boy, you can beat any navy on the Mediterranean. And if you got a guy who can raise people from the dead with a word, well, we can't raise people from the dead, but we sure know how to kill them. So if you can raise them with a word, he could kill them with a word. With Jesus, you would fear no army. So why is Jesus doing miracles, and why do the Pharisees, and even Herod, a little bit later, Jesus will be arrested. And Herod said, oh, you got that Jesus in custody? Bring him here. Jesus, I want you to do some tricks for me. And what does Jesus do? Nothing. Silence. What's he doing with those miracles? They imagine he's doing what emperors did with their triumphs, what politicians today would do. Can you imagine if a politician today had the power to multiply loaves and fishes? He'd be like, hey, bring your hungry people here. I'll be giving out food. Well, that's what politicians do anyway, right? It's give out stuff. But they couldn't see the signs. And you say, well, what sign? Isn't he refusing to do a sign? And actually, he would do a sign. And that sign would change the world. Just this week, a new book came out by an English scholar named Tom Holland. And Tom Holland is an interesting guy. When he was a little boy, he was really into dinosaurs. And he was in church because at that point, all the little English boys and girls, they would have a little bit of Christian training in schools because England, unlike the United States, is a Christian nation by decree. The Queen is the protector and the head of the Church of England, along with the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so little Tom Holland was in Sunday school, and there was a picture in a Bible book of Adam and Eve and a dinosaur. And he loved dinosaurs, and he said dinosaurs weren't around with people. So he asked his Sunday school teacher, what's the deal with this picture of Adam and Eve and the T-Rex? And it wasn't a T-Rex, it was another dinosaur. And the Sunday school teacher just kind of blew him off. And from that point, he decided the church has nothing to say to me because the church doesn't deal with the coolest things I know, which are dinosaurs. And he grew up and he was really interested in Roman history and stories about the Caesars and their great conquest and all of the pageantry and drama of the classical world. And so he became a scholar in this and became an author in this. And his first best-selling book was this book called Rubicon, when Caesar crosses the Rubicon. And so he's actually been a very successful author writing books like this. And then he wrote a book about the rise of Islam. And some Muslims didn't like what he wrote in that book. So one guy said to him, hey, why don't you write a book about the start of your own religion? And he's like, well, I don't have a religion, but well, maybe it'd be interesting to write about the beginning of Christianity. So then he starts to do some research. And he begins to learn what a cross is and why the Romans used it. And he begins to learn that actually absolutely everything in the West, all of our assumptions that morality is being kind and good to the poor and destitute, these are all ideas that came because of one man in history, and that man giving the sign that was no sign that anyone would ever believe, was the most counter-political sign you could ever imagine, changed the world. Imagine you've got to write a story in which for the first time someone who suffers the excruciating death of a slave is going to be cast as being in some way part of the Creator God who's fashioned everything. And he's got to be convincing, not just to people 2,000 years ago, but for the 2,000 years and across the whole span of the world. It's really astonishing thing to have pulled off as a literary feat. And that 4 people did it is amazing. What's he saying? He's saying that everybody in the ancient world seeing Jesus on a cross would say, yep, loser. Rome wins. Jesus is just another guy who got a little bit of popularity and he's gone now. And when he's on that cross, they mock him and they say, boy, he stilled a storm with a word. He multiplied loaves and fishes. He healed people. But look at him up there on the cross, impotent, weak, for our mockery and enjoyment. But that's not what cross means anymore. You see, Christians bear witness, not so much by miracles, but by love. This past week I did a debate with someone online, and he's an atheist, and he described himself as a gender abolitionist and a communist socialist type character. And he thinks that there should be no gender anymore, that everyone should just be kind to one another. And I noticed well, sort of he has the same goals that Christianity offered him, but he doesn't understand where they come from. So then I asked him, I said, well, how do you want to be treated? If you would get old and get Alzheimer's, would you like your spouse to look at you and say, oh, you're not much fun anymore. You lost your mind. I'm going to go find someone fun. Would you like to be treated like that? Well, no. How would you like to be treated? Would you like the other person to sacrifice for your welfare and your well-being, even if they're getting nothing out of it? Well, yeah. Well, where would we get the idea that one person would suffer on behalf of another, freely, voluntarily, at great expense and cost to themselves? It came from that sign, that man on the cross, who changed all of history, doing a thing that anybody living in the Roman world would have seen again and again in their life, hanging from a Roman political instrument of execution. No miracle, just love. Everyone wants to be loved sacrificially, but loving sacrificially seems irresponsible. Well, what sign is Jesus talking about? Well, on the night he was betrayed. And as I said, we have a certain amount of contempt for our political rivals, but we save the choicest contempt for our political traitors. And on the night he was betrayed, he didn't say to his disciples, go hunt down that Judas and kill him in the street and make an example of him, for everyone who crosses me will suffer the same death. That's what Roman crucifixion was. That's what people normally practice. Jesus looks across the table at Judas and says, Judas, what you're going to do, go and do quickly. And on the night he was betrayed, he took bread. And I'm sure at that moment the disciples remembered those fields out in nowhere where there had thousands of people around them, no longer around them that night. And how he took bread and he lifted his eyes to heaven and he multiplied it. Now he takes bread and he broke it. And he didn't say, this is the prosperity I'm going to give to everyone who follows me and makes me king. He says, this is my body broken for you. Whenever you eat bread, remember me. This is the sign. And in fact, you need no miracle to recognize the sign. We see the sign every day. Every day a mother gets up in the middle of the night to feed a crying child. We see the sign every day a daughter-in-law takes care of her in-laws in the home. We see the sign every time a spouse of someone suffering from Alzheimer's or stroke or something else spends years of their life making good on a promise they made when they were 20 years old and knew nothing about what it would cost them. We see that sign, which we desperately long to see and hope to believe that all of that sacrifice is not for nothing, but is for joy and promise and resurrection. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it and said, this is my body broken for you. Whenever you see bread, remember me and remember the sign. The elders are going to distribute this bread now. And this bread is a sign. It's a sign and a seal. And by taking it, you signify you're in agreement. You're willing to be laid down. You're willing to participate. You too are willing to be a sign. And you signify that you have need, that you are in debt, that you are beholden, that you need him to give you his life because you're insufficient to give it to another. That's why he gives it to you. Take, eat, remember, and believe that the body of our Lord was given for the complete forgiveness of all your sins. That same evening, he took a cup and said, "This is a new covenant in my blood." Whereas before, the blood of animals was given in place for your guilt, now I myself give my life as one final sacrifice for your complete freedom. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. So lay down your burden, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your face. O wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart. Come as you are. has no sorrow that heaven can't cure. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't cure. So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your face. O wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your heart, come as you are, fall in his arms, come as you are. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. Lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your face. O wanderer, come home. You're not too far. Lay down your heart, come as you are. Take, drink, remember, and believe that the Lord of heaven and earth gave himself up for the forgiveness of all your sins. Would you stand? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you his peace. Amen.